Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to our presentation of the FIBREE UOI webinar. Today, we've got a few people on the call, so we'll hear from Jo Bronckers, who will be talking about the UOI, an answer to identifying not only buildings, but their flaws, their items, and how we're working together, and how he's working together with the Dutch government on POCs. We'll be hearing from Kevin O'Grady, who will talk about the real use application of the UOI and its use in the circular economy, and Ranga Krishnan, who will talk about the Resolver registry, and he'll describe that in great detail later. Myself, I am CEO of BuildSort. I am building a blockchain-based contract for construction startup. We're currently working on our first POC for a waste to energy plant, $500 million waste to energy plant, and helping the principal there, with all of his contractual requirements and getting that through. We've got some great interest in the UOI because as you work with contracts, you need to identify certain items and how they work together. So today, before we start, just wanted to talk about blockchain and give everyone a brief overview of why blockchain is the answer within the real estate industry. So in many places, you find that multiple parties that don't trust each other. There's generally no trusted central party in any state. Now, and one of the biggest things that I always hear about blockchain is it's very costly and slow. But however, the cost of trust is something that is much bigger, and the cost of trust for blockchain is small in comparison to the way we do things today. So when those things come together, that's the reason when you really need to use blockchain. We've also got lots of data silos between many different parties, and the big thing with real estate is we need to identify different parties as well. So digital identities are making a big difference to this. There's also different things that are coming about because of blockchain. So we have tokenization. So when we start to fractionalize property ownership. So taking little pieces. There's projects around. Some people call them bricks. So there's a project here in Australia where I am. They call them bricks. So you can buy a brick of a building. And use that as part of your investments. We've got the UOI, which we'll hear about very shortly. This is identifying pieces of buildings and identifying those which can be used for things like tracking and tracing of elements. We've had problems with flammable cladding and things like that. Building and planning approvals, smart legal contracts, which is my real focus with the project that I'm working on. Carbon accounting, so accounting for all of the carbon that is used to build projects, and this is one of the biggest industries. The polluters in the world, I believe it's about 30% of the world's carbon is actually released from the built environment. We're also looking at reusability and the circular economies. Land registries has also been a big on in this stage. So there is lots of countries around the world that the land registry is either done, they don't exist, or they're done very piecemeal with counties and things like that. So there's lots of things where blockchain will come in. Now, just a brief overview on FIBREE. You can see from the map behind me, we've got participants from all around the world. So this is a real group of people from all around the world. They're all either builders, they're building their own projects, academics or industry professionals. So we haven't had anyone shilling tokens or things like that you would normally find in most other blockchain groups and things like that. So this is real people trying to solve real problems. There is a industry report talking about many of the projects that FIBREE is working on, and I will put a link to that report. I encourage everyone to have a read of that, and it is a very good read. So today we have registrations from all around the world. So we've got people from the United Kingdom, Portugal, United States, Brazil, Netherlands, Italy, Nigeria, Luxembourg, Greece, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, Germany, India, and Serbia. So very much a global thing. Now, without too much further ado, I will hand you over to Jo Bronckers, who will be talking about the unique object identifier. So, bit of a introduction. Jo Bronckers is from the Netherlands. He's a professional background in real estate. He studied in real estate management and development in the Eindhoven Technical University. He worked for the Dutch international real estate investors, asset managers, and real estate banks before he decided to start his own consultancy company for his business development in the intersection of real estate and new technologies like blockchain. Jo was in 2018 co-founder and vice president of the executive board at the Foundation for International Blockchain and Real Estate Expertise, FIBREE. At FIBREE, he is developing the unique object identification, UOI concept is for enhanced real estate data exchange and aggregation. With FIBREE, Jo is the active member in different working groups of Identifier, and in 2020, Jo became the inaugural board of eCreda and the European Commercial Real Estate Data Alliance. Furthermore, he's an advisor to several startups in the realm of blockchain and real estate. So over to you, Jo. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Before I start my presentation, I want to endorse you to use the chat window. After we have had the presentations, we will have the Q&A, and then we will look to all the questions. So please take active part in this webinar. If you go to my slides, where are we coming from and why are we looking to a unique object identifier at FIBREE? In the Netherlands, one of the first meetings that I organized was kind of a workshop. I wanted to know, before we were putting an agenda together, what are the questions that people have in our network? And people said, okay, when we're going to talk about blockchain, we see that the market is going to be more and more digitized. How are we going to exchange digital information about buildings? And who's doing what with this information? And how can we get rid of all these silos? And how, in the end, can we create more a building passport that information can be attached to the building and follow the building and along its entire life cycle? So no matter what events happen, how can the information stay with the building? Well, this was a challenge, and what you see in this picture is the exponential growth of information. It's not only information about the building itself. If you look in the left graph, you see the little gray part in the bottom of the graph. This is more the traditional data that we have about building, but more and more data are becoming additional available, and mostly they come from the machines. Most machines have more and more sensors, or from the human interaction with machines and buildings via smart devices. And this creates more and more complex cloud of data. When you want to have data, certain data, it's becoming more and more complex to get them available, to be sure that they are accurate, that that you can trust them. And therefore, the market told us in the Netherlands, why not look how we can solve this complexity? Because in the future, it will be more and more. In the future, we will also have additional information fields that we want to add to real estate. An important thing in Europe is Europe wants to become CO2 neutral in 2050. And what you see in the graph is that in the next 30 years, a lot of CO2 emissions need to be reduced, need to be brought back to zero. And if you then look to what is the contribution the real estate sector can do, we see that real estate is very impactful. Half of all the raw materials that we use end up in a building. 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from a building. I think 30% of all the landfill comes from waste that comes after renovation or demolition in buildings. Well, in the European government, they want to start the renovation wave. They want all the buildings. We have 250 million homes in Europe. Those are accounting for 75% of all the building stocks. 25% is commercial space. And all these buildings need to be renovated in the next 30 years, because we think 85 to 90% of the buildings we will have in 2050 are already there. And you can question yourselves, what do we know about these buildings? A lot of information needs to be produced, also lots of new information, and we think it's going to be digital. But how can we organize this and structure this in the right way? Circular economy is something that Kevin is going to talk about. If we want to create circular models, we need to have better information in the end of materials. And how can we organize that? Well, many complexities. And if we then take a closer look on how data is organized in real estate, that we see in the left screen, in the left figure, that the real estate cycle, the life cycle, is stretching over many decades, and it follows different stages. But what we also know is that in the current situation, a lot of information gets lost when information goes to the next part of this industry chain. Information about the design stays with the architect. Information about how the building was constructed stays with all the contractors. Information about the first ownership and the rental contracts and the maintenance, they're not handed over to the next owners in a appropriate way. So every time again, if we want to do something with the building, we need to hire third parties and check the data that we have, upgrade them so that we can make the right decisions. We can actually, we spoil a lot of resources there. We can organize this a lot more efficient. If you look in the right screen, there you have the different levels of availability of data. If you're a large portfolio manager, or if you're a municipality or a government, you want to have more aggregated data in the top of this pyramid, but more and more data are coming from the bottom, very granular data. And how can we better organize them, structure them, so that the people in the top of the pyramid can trust that the information they get is the right information, and that it's correct, and that it's recent information. So we see more and more challenges with all these data. Well, how did we start in the Netherlands? First, we look to how is the information available? And we found out, what you see in the left part, that information is not always about a building itself. Sometimes it's on a higher level of aggregation. It's about an entire building block, a street, or a municipality or district, or perhaps about a portfolio. But sometimes also it is about lower levels of detail. For example, about the installations, the elevator maintenance, so some certification of parts in the building, or the woodwork or whatever. So everybody is approaching information from his own perspective. And then we saw in the middle that this chain, that people who were operating close to each other, that they wanted to come to standards, and everybody tried to reduce the number of different identifiers, to reduce the number of silos. But what none of them did was try to find a solution how we can connect the data, how can we create this interoperable landscape. And for blockchain technology to have more value, you should create more interoperability so that multiple parties can get access, can work with data, can enrich it. And that's what you see in the circle below. And once architect starts making a design, how can then the constructor enrich the information how it was constructed? How can a municipality enrich information how the permit was issued? And how can the owners, how can they enrich it once they order the maintenance works, so that in the end, information is in the correct way available about all the things that have happened in the building, or in the moment that you want to sell the building, that you have crucial information available. The question is, how can we organize this? And that's how we started to look at unique object identifier. In the current world, you see that you have many more and more applications on the left side. You have data sources on the right side, and to connect them, we built APIs. But with the exponential growth of data and of sources, and this will be a very complex situation. And every time again, developing an API is also a cost-intensive operation. So why not make this a lot easier? And that's what you see in the right side. We thought, if in theory everybody is going to connect to only one identifier that we put in the middle, then both sides, if they have this connection to this one identifier, the UOI, then this UOI can become a connector key. And this can make the interoperability a lot easier. If everybody is going to embrace this, then in theory, you can use and rely on only one API. Well, therefore, we also need to create a set of agreements, because who is owning a UOI? Our vision is that this should be infrastructure, and infrastructure should not be owned by one party. It should actually be owned by everybody. So how can we create an open source infrastructure that helps us to become this connector key, that helps us to connect all the different databases? And that's part of the research we did in the Netherlands. The middle last year, we developed a 0.8 version. And there we said, okay, many of the identifiers that we know in the building, in the built environment, they somehow have a context dependency, and that makes them very inflexible to use. And if you then take into account that every country has its own systems, there are so many context dependent identifiers around, that is very complex. So we want to accept all the identifiers that are there, but we want to create this UOI as a completely context independent open source infrastructure in between. And what does this mean? We look to the software industry, where they were using UUIDs and GUIDs. Those are the numbers like you see above. Actually, a totally context independent number. And how can we then create a mandatory level that connects with the owner of a building? Because we think information also always needs to connect people. There's an owner of the building who should be in charge of all the UIs that he has in the building. So we start on the ownership level, which is, if it is a single family home, it is the building level, or if it is a commercial real estate, or when you're talking about apartments or condominiums, then it's on the unit level. We say this is a mandatory level. If we issue a UOI as a context independent number, like you see here, then we have a starting point. We have an owner and we have a UOI that is representing the building. But then we can create a set of sub-UOIs, perhaps on the level of the room or the wall or the parts of elements in the wall, until we reach the product levels. And once we make an agreement that all the lower levels of detail, that the UOIs that are going to be issued on those lower levels, once they are connected to the mandatory level, the ownership level, then this owner can have control over the entire taxonomy that he creates, that tells him where sources can be found that hold information about his building. And this helps us to keep the information together. The same he can do on higher levels. If it belongs to a portfolio or to a municipality, we can issue a UOI on that level and we can connect them. So now we have created a taxonomy, a tree of keys that help us to connect to all these different identifiers. And all together, if we keep them well together, we can follow the life cycle of the building. Once we do a merger or a split of units, then we can create new UOIs, but keep the historical connection available, because we store the history of UOIs in blockchain. Well, having done that, the second stage of the UOI development in the Netherlands started in autumn. And here, together with Genovum, Cadastre, and the Dutch Ministry of Interior, we're going to look how the system of UI can be embedded in the international standards framework on geospatial area. But we're also going to do 4 pilot projects to demonstrate technically and to find out if and how this UI can be implemented. And that's what is almost completed in the Netherlands. We will have 2 or 3 more weeks to complete the first pilots, and later this year we have completed them all. And this will be very valuable to bring this 0.8 version to the 1.0 version and then start implementing it in the Netherlands. Well, you see that also in other countries via the network of FIBREE and via INATBA network and via the RESO network, they were starting to look at if this UI can be somehow implemented or made compatible with existing developments. And until now, we have had very promising pilots that are starting. But we also have the USA or Australia or other countries, European Commission, who want to see if this UI system can be somehow brought to an international infrastructure level. I hope that we will tell you more about that in the next few years. The last thing that I wanted to show is the pilots we do in the Netherlands. And what you see in this screen is we wanted to make it very easy, focus on simple information. If you have a building and if you want to install solar panels, how can we create this in different data sources, and how can other data use it? So we said one pilot is going to focus on creating a building passport. The second pilot is going to look how can we store information about materials within a building. And a third pilot was looking to how can we know the energy performance, the energy capacity that is produced in buildings, and how can we manage this for the energy grid. Well, here we have the solar panels. And what we did, the first pilot, we wanted to show in the building passport that we installed 6 solar panels on the roof. Well, this information was not stored in the building renovation passport, but we want to make it visible. The information we wanted to make visible was stored in CIRDAX. This is the material passport pilot. So somehow we wanted to use the UI to get access to this other pilot and to get the information to the building renovation passport and make it visible. This is this interoperable, decentralized data landscape that we want to foster with this UI. Well, it started with the humans. Information, there's always a human on the beginning and at the other side. If he grants access from the building renovation passport, he grants access to the material passport. He says, I want to have from this building on this certain level, I want to have access to your data. And then this person at the right side, he grants his access. Then the systems know that information can be exchanged. So what you then see is that this user can have his information that the 6 panels are on the roof. But if he has additional information, then he can, because he have the access on the lowest level, he can get back to the material passport and he can get all the information that is stored in the material passport about the building. He can get it back in his building passport and make this available. And this, for us, was a very important milestone because it proved how the UI can be put in between of different systems and help to get access, the people get access, but also help to continuously work with exchanging information. And I think this is very promising now to show this to connect it with other pilots. And I think what Kevin is going to do is an example how we want to extend it to multiple users. That's where we are. That's why we are developing UI. We think a UI can help reducing management costs for real estate information, but might also be a trigger to have more transparency and therefore increase the value of real estate. And this, in the end, is beneficial for all stakeholders in the market. I think this is it, what I want to present today. And I give it back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. That was really great to hear all about it and the successes you're having. If anyone is interested, has any questions for Jo, please put it in the chat now, and at the end of this, we'll put them to Jo. So next up, we've got Kevin. So Kevin's going to be Kevin O'Grady. He will be presenting the ARIP pilot for the circular economy. So Kevin is an associate director with ARIP. He has over 33 years of international experience in cost, commercial and project controls integration across major construction portfolios, programs and projects. Previously, commercial manager on London Heathrow Terminal 2 and Abu Dhabi Midfield Terminal. From an electrical engineering background, his understanding of key drivers and disseminating across teams, motives and delivering the right solution, specializing in digital integration, business case analysis, option appraisals, life cycle costing, and the evaluating and the application of environmental technologies. Advisor to the latest government thinking on new forms and procurement on the value toolkit, an active member of the British Standards for Life Cycle Costing CB 101, and a board member and London co-chair for FIBREE Foundation, the international blockchain and real estate expertise. So over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and a pleasure to be here today. First of all, I'd like to go through this pilot we're doing on a major rail project in the UK. And the premise of this pilot was to unlock circular economy. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation are one of the leaders in circular economy, and ARIP have been a partner with Ellen MacArthur for many years. And if we look at this, this is called the butterfly diagram, and you can download this. It's probably worth going on the Ellen MacArthur website and reading it. Some fantastic information available on their website. But the part that we're looking at is on the right-hand side. So the right-hand side looks at the construction material, and the biggest benefit we can do in circular economy looks through what they call the 9 R's, from rethinking, so thinking about the actual construction before you start. So do we actually need a construction, which sounds a bit strange coming from an engineering firm to say, do we actually need the construction? But we need to move away from the sort of make, take, and then throw away society. So to do that, recycling is very good. It's a good way of circular economy, but the closer we move to those loops nearer the circle and keep the materials in use for as long as possible, the better it is for the environment. So the premise of our pilot was circular economy. So we needed to keep information available right to the very end of a building. And most buildings go between 60 and 100 years. Bridges go on to 120, 150 years. So how do we keep that information available for that longer period? And the benefits of it. So this pilot looked at locking in the disassembly information into the construction information at the very beginning, so that at the end of life of a building, we have the information almost like a reverse IKEA manual. So you'd have your manual to disassemble the building at the very end. And then from that, we would also have the environmental product data, so the EPD data. So that helps you understand how much of those materials can actually be reused. But this sort of information link to the end is like a golden thread of information. And this sort of leads us on very nicely to solving another problem that's very topical at the moment. So we all know about the Grenfell tragedy in 2017, where some of the cladding panels on there had been changed during the design that led to the tragedy of the building being engulfed in flames. So as part of an independent review, Dame Judith Hackett carried out an independent review on the building regulations, and that's led to new standards that have come through from British standards that are coming through about fire safety and about recording information. I've highlighted a couple of points in her findings here that I'll run through the next couple of slides. And basically her findings were sort of asking governments to mandate a digital standard to make sure that we have these records from design right the way through to post-construction and really into reuse, not just for residential buildings, but really for all buildings. And these records should include information, including refurbishment. So her finding is asking us to keep records right the way through the building life. And that's exactly what we're trying to do on this pilot for a major rail infrastructure, making sure his data is available. So this process in her report said the process will be made much easier if the data is available. So not only having this data, making sure that people can access it, sort of a digital twin. And the digital twin is making sure the information is all contained in one place. So this is, although we're trying to unlock circular economy, there's many benefits of this pilot. The pilot started in April and it will finish in September. And we've got some great partners on this, on the journey of this pilot. We've got the RICS and we've got many academia from Cardiff University that will be writing up this pilot and making that available. So we'll be giving updates hopefully as we go through the pilot. So when you start the design stage, the bit about keeping all the records at design and construction is very important. So we know with the advent of BIM and it's now an international standard against BIM. The 19650 is now it was originally a PAS standard, but now it's internationally recognised, and it's on a lot of these projects you go around the world are using this ISO international standard for doing data taxonomy within a building site. And within the government's own Digital Built Britain, they're looking at all the other advantages you'll get from a BIM blockchain. And some of that are DFMA, drones, digital twins, but the bit that we were highlighting on is DLT, the distributed ledger technology. Within the information as it's born at the design stage, making sure that information is tracked. So what we've done, we've recorded that information into the building specification. And we're building on to works that was done on a trial for HS2, which is a 2.5-year pilot that myself and Jo were part of this pilot, looking at blockchain. And also companies like SAP were involved, Tata Steel, RICS were involved in this pilot. But this pilot that we did for HS2 only looked at the construction stage. It looked at when the design's done to when payments are released on site. Although this is very, very useful, it missed the part that obviously if you can start from the design specification and keep that information right the way through to the recycling stage, we're answering a lot of the questions that were brought up in the independent inquiry from Grenfell, and also unlocking that circular economy. So the Arup digital specification will have information about it. Any changes to that specification will be recorded and put onto a dashboard. So also you'd maybe seen behavioural change so that people know when they're going to do a value engineering on a building product, they know that that information and the digital fingerprint of that change will be recorded for the building life. So hopefully the behavioural changes will come into play as well, knowing that you can track down the changes from the original design intent right the way through to construction. So there may be bits that the site blockchain will record, which is purchase orders, maybe the distribution, the installation, and even payment. Some of this information we may want to pick up, some we may not. But the main part is that once it's handed over to the FM provider, he has the information from which to service that building. And while he services that building, he's also adding to the record of every service interval for that asset. So that at the end, if we look at maybe like your car purchase, we all know that a car is worth higher value if it has a service record. We believe that assets will have a higher value if we know they've been maintained and looked after during the life whilst they're in the building. And maybe even it would lend itself to be a leased or as a service product instead of a make, take and throw away society. So that leads me on to the in-use stage. So while it's in use, making sure these records are available is very key. So this information isn't put into a blockchain vault not to be opened up. We want as much, and as the more information that gets put in, the more rich the data becomes. As we're learning from how the asset is performing, very much like the Ronseal test, does it do what it says on the tin? Will this actually perform for 30 years? Will the asset last for 40 years? Does it last for 50 years? All this information, when it goes back into our specifications, will actually improve specifications of the future. We'll be using fact, not people's experience or opinions about how the next specifications will develop. So the records must include information about refurbishments of the building. So another point that was raised during the independent inquiry, this is important that we record what happens to that asset so we can learn. Maybe at the recycling stage, we can only recover 10% of the material, or maybe we can actually recover 90% of the material, which means that we're improving all the time on our recycling information. So working alongside Jo on this pilot with Arup, we've started to strategize and put in how this would work from the design engineer, have the information in one place as a design specification, the construction engineer, to the in-use, and then to the recycling stage, and how this will work, keeping the records not only from the design, construction, but also post-construction, feeding back into the designs of the future. So if you look at how it looks as when you bring it all together, talked about the design stage, very important to get that information into a passport. We talked about the construction stage, very important for all the changes in there. And at this stage, before you go to tender, we would ask for environmental product data. We would ask for the reverse IKEA manual. We would ask for all service records that are required for that at this stage. So then the FM guy has the records available for him to look after the assets as much as possible. And we would hope at this stage, the assets will be worth a much higher value because of this data. And the data itself would be of value. We could sell that data to manufacturers. You could sell the data back to people to show that how the assets are performing. Currently, a lot of these links between these stages are broken. We don't have this link of information back to the design stage. So this project, although it was looking at primarily about circular economy, we've seen so many more user cases and so many more benefits from this pilot. And that's my presentation. Chris, thanks very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Great presentation. I can see some great benefits of what you're doing. I've got some great questions for you at the end of this. Now, I do ask everyone else to please put your questions in the chat window, and we'll give those to Kevin afterwards. So next up, we've got Ranga Krishnan. So Ranga will be talking about the Reso Unique ID Registry, Resolver Registry. Ranga is the founder and CEO of BEIRE, a startup that is applying blockchain technology to make real estate data more comprehensive, trustworthy, and available in real time. He obtained his real estate license in California after founding BEIRE, and he could understand the need that CRE brokers have first, and his commercial real estate broker at Ritchie Commercial in San Jose, California. With support from the local brokerage community, he is launching his transaction alerting and private data sharing service for Silicon Valley CRE professionals. BEIRE works with residential real estate sector, as well as by helping organizations implement the Reso Distributed Ledger Working Group recommendations. As Vice President of Technology at Scoocane, he founded and led the BAFT, Bankers Association for Finance and Trade, DLPC, Distributed Ledger Payments Commitment Working Group, and was recognized as a significant step forward for trade, finance, and banking. He is a founder of the FIBREE UPI/UOI working group that is providing content for this webinar. Ranga used to enjoy training for marathons and Ironman triathlons. Nowadays, he's lucky to get out every so often for a weekend bike ride in the San Francisco Bay Area. Ranga will present the rationale behind the creation of blockchain-based unique ID resolver registry. Specifically, he will explain the unique ID resolver is, why we need it for a registry such as resolvers, and why distributed ledgers are perfectly suited for creating a resolver registry. He will then explain the progress Rezo has made in defining and implementing the unique ID resolver registry, and what are the next steps for his initiative to engage with the projects that have been announced in the FIBREE UOI UPID working groups. Okay, thanks, Ranga, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Let's see, is this coming through?
Yes.
Okay. So, FIBREE, as you mentioned, we try to improve the availability and real-time access to data. And so in that context, this project is trying to stitch together data regarding properties where multiple different IDs are maintained for a given property, right? So it could be from a postal address, it could be from a tax authority. So there are multiple IDs for a property, and the data that Jo and also Kevin talked about always has an ID in it, but for the same property, depending on the type of data, it could be a different ID. So if you want to have a collective view of all of the data related to a property, you need to be able to connect all of those IDs and say that they point to the same one. So that's something that Jo was talking about in the UI. And I'm going to talk about how that actually needs a resolver registry. This work, it comes through three RESO working groups. RESO is the Real Estate Standards Organization in the US, but its specs are used more widely outside the US as well. And in the Distributed Ledger Working Group, Mark Leswing initiated this activity to build this registry, working with also the UPI working group, which is the Unique Property ID working group, and also the ULI, which is the Unique Licensee ID for real estate agents. So what is a unique ID resolver? So for example, the RESO defines three kinds of unique IDs, one for properties, one for agents, and one for organizations. And in the case of properties and agents, the same entity, a property or an agent, could have multiple IDs. So what we want is to map those multiple IDs to that unique ID that RESO has defined. And so that connection is what you see in the left. And from now on, I'm going to talk mostly about just the property ID and not talk about the agent or licensee ID. So to connect the property ID to some other ID for that same entity, which I call a search ID here. So that connection recorded is a fact, and there is a provider of facts that could create those records. And then a resolver essentially relies on that database of facts and answers queries such as, here is a search ID, please provide me the unique property ID, or vice versa. Here's a unique property ID, can you provide me the tax ID or some other specific ID for that property? And business entities such as data providers, or it could be the MLSs in this country which maintain real estate data, could all operate these resolver entities. And this is what I call the primary data. So you see in the top right, the data. Now, what registries have to do with is sort of metadata, because the way that arises is when the user has a certain ID and they want to find the unique ID, which resolver do they ask that question to? So that is the problem that we're going to be talking about today. And so that is a metadata problem. And so I have that metadata in the corner on all the slides to remind people and not confuse it with the primary data. And so the metadata problem comes down to, who would answer that, which resolver would answer that question. And then the second is, how is the user going to have confidence that that resolver's information is actually correct? So the answer to that is to have a trusted registry, which has all these resolvers, and the user can find the appropriate resolver and query it, right? And so a resolver operated by a business entity could advertise multiple capabilities. So the items in blue are IDs related to the licensee ID, and the ones in orange are related to property. And so as you see, there are a large number of these IDs. And so any subset of these could be advertised by a business entity as something that it can resolve and provide answers to. And so that business entity would have a resolver profile. The middle part shows the set of IDs that they are willing to resolve. But then also, they are credentialed by RISO to be a valid resolver. And so there are the credentials, and then their own business identity. So that profile, that resolver profile, needs to be advertised to the world so that people can discover it and then ask the resolver these questions. And so the question is, what is a good way to do that? And distributed ledgers are a great way to do that, because this information, the resolver's profile, is actually public information. And so you can put it out on a ledger and let everybody have a copy. By doing that, you also ensure that there is not a central point of failure, because everybody has a copy of the data. They are querying their own copy of the data to find the resolver that they need. And at the same time, we maintain trust through the blockchain's integrity properties. And so when you have these registries for resolvers, one of the nice things you can do is the data itself lives with the resolvers themselves and could be completely private. And all their advertising is what they're able to do, and then parties can query them for that. So I'm quickly going to talk about the implementation. I'll leave more time for some questions to answer some specific things about how this relates to other aspects of what's been talked about today. So some of the assumptions in the proof of concept that we've built is that we should be able to support the unique property ID, and then we should also be able to support the unique licensee ID. We are not at this point doing the recording of these service claims, but just the responding to queries about them. And that there should be a way to certify a resolver using a certificate from RISO. And that certificate happens through a normal certificate issuance process, where the business entity would provide its public key to RISO, and then RISO, which would have a unique organizational ID for it, would then provide it the certificate. And very quickly, there are two important records in this implementation. One is a service claim record, that is a business entity that is claiming to provide a certain service. So these are all some of the aspects of that service. And the key one is that there is a service claim ID, which is unique. And there's also a from type and to type. So from type could be, for example, a parcel ID. The to type is what is returned, and it could be the unique property ID. Or you could put in an address and you could get a unique property ID. So there are, that part is specified in the from and to. And the other is a record for the resolver itself. And this is something that is entered by RISO into the blockchain, saying that this is the name of the resolver. This is the resolver ID, unique ID, which was in the service claim record. At the bottom, you see it there. And that this entity has a certain unique organizational identity that is recorded by RISO, and that it needs to sign its records like the service claim record with a certificate, with keys as specified in the certificate issued by RISO on top. So essentially the process is RISO will provide a certificate and also enter that record into the blockchain. And then that entity will be able to create service claims for whichever services it provides. And the ledger will actually enforce certain rules and make sure that things are valid through smart contracts. And if you look at the overall picture, this is what it looks like, that a resolver record is referenced by a service claim, and the user is then, through the direct reference item right on top, able to query that service and answer their questions. So with that, this distributed ledger-based resolver registry will be live for trial use very soon. And if you're interested in participating, please contact me through that email address there. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranga. Okay, so we are running pretty close to time. I think we might only have just one question for each of the speakers. Well, first one for you, Ranga. What is the correct pronunciation of your company name?
It is FIBREE, like buy real estate, because that's a good idea.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. Okay, so first one for you, Ranga, as well. How is the unique ID resolver registry related to the UOI implementation that Jo spoke about earlier?
Right. So what Jo spoke about is what I referenced in the first slide as the data part. It is the primary data. And in fact, what Jo has been talking about is the data itself. The next thing, as I mentioned, is each data has to have an ID so that you can connect it to a particular property. And that connection between those IDs is what I called a fact, and that is, in the data. And so it's all operating at a data level, whereas this is answering a different question, which is like, who should I ask these questions to, right? So it's solving this metadata question. So I think the work is kind of complementary. So there could be other initiatives for resolving IDs or connecting IDs other than UOI, and they could participate, and so could UOI, in advertising its capabilities through this registry.
Excellent. Okay. Now we've got a question that has come in on the chat. So Jo and Kevin, how do you convince investors to engage with most of the investments that are done in existing properties, which means that many of the USPs you mentioned won't be available?
Do you want to go first, Jo?
Yep, perfect. Well, I think this is probably the biggest challenge we have with UOI. The UOI, most of the new developments are focusing on solving one problem for one client and create value in a very short term. But actually, the nature of blockchain is how can we create more collaborative networks? And we think what is yet missing, and that's the reason why we have this inefficiency with using all the silos. The problem is that we cannot connect data in the right way. And for investors, this is a big problem because they want to have more and more data. For example, ESG performance. How can they have data that they can trust? This is a big challenge. And it is not only the investors, it's also municipalities, it's also maintenance people. So everybody is taking part in this problem, has a stake in the problem. But I think the investors is probably the most important group of stakeholders we should face to, because if we manage to give them better access, they're in the top of the hierarchy of the real estate market. If we can prove that this UOI creates value for them, then I think they can start embracing it. And when they start embracing it, we saw in previous digitalization efforts, when the large stakeholders, when they start embracing it, they are going to hire clients and put as a request to them that they are going to use this identifiers. And when it starts in the top of this hierarchy, then in the next 5 to 10 years, we think this will go through the entire market. And that's why we think investors is one of the key stakeholders to focus at first.
Very good question, Roland. And it's a problem a lot of people face about information for existing buildings. We work in a lot of schools and hospitals where that's very much the case. And we worked for Philips in the UK, where we've done Matterport scans and reality captures of existing spaces and tried to link data to these reality captures. So with having like a walk-through Google map of your building where you can walk through, and these cameras are coming down in price, and we're seeing that you can even do it now on an iPhone. You can do these scans. So it's linking that data and making existing buildings having information, or even if you say scan the building and show that there's no information available and push that back to the FM department, then they can then start going for looking for that information and assigning it to the drawing. So the blockchain has a key role in that, in linking the data from a 3D view or a reality capture back to the information. So we're finding we're doing that for a lot of clients with existing portfolios where there's poor information. We're scanning a lot of buildings and trying to retrofit information back into it. And for investors, if there is a capture of an existing building, I think for insurance purposes or point in time or where the nearest smoke detector is in a room, all that is credible information that needs to be recorded in data. And I think blockchain has a big role to play in that.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So Kevin, I've got one for you. So throughout the construction, there's going to be many of these people that handle materials. So capturing this data must be done by many laggards. You know, these are the labourers that are doing the works on site. And as pointed out by Jo in his presentation, that all needs to be taken from, you know, the base level of that pyramid and fed up the chain. So how do you incentivize those people to actually start committing all of this data to chain? And
yeah, no, I like that, Chris. Yeah, very good question, because we're looking at for this one particular client, and we realized that if you try now halfway through a project and try and instigate people capturing information, it's very hard. It needs to be specified in the contract. So the contract of employment. So on this particular pilot, we're working with them so that when you onboard a designer and go out to tender for a designer, you're asking them to make sure that the data they're providing becomes available throughout the project. And then the designer needs to onboard the construction contractor, and you need to make sure that he's legally bound to make sure that information is available. So in his contract, you would put clauses in there that says making available information through his supply chain. And then it's important that you bring on board your FM contractor with the same premise at the bottom, that you're trying to drive out, take waste philosophy and try and have that behaviors right the way through the supply chain. So that in the contracts for the FM guy, because there's going to be multiple stakeholders, you're right, Chris, there's going to be multiple stakeholders. If it's in their contract that they have to use a platform that's provided at the design stage, the platform that we're providing for this client through FIBREE and the team on this project, that they are contracted to add to that data. And the FM guy will have a logbook within the specification that he's contracted to put the service intervals into. So I think a lot of it is you'd like people to come on board and get involved, but you normally find that if they're not contracted to do something, you're not going to get those benefits. So I think procurement is the fundamental part. So as part of the pilot, we have a whole layer of procurement activities to make sure the client gets those services without contractually requiring it from people. Yeah, I don't think you'd get the adoption. It's very hard to do, like Roland was saying, very hard to retrospectively go back. It's very much easier if you've got a clean canvas that you can then put those regulations into. But we can all see there's like a state of emergency. We need to act very quickly. So I think this is the urgency to get people to think about responsibly putting the right products into buildings will mean we won't have as much going to landfill, which will mean that we won't have to recycle anything. We're just going to reuse it because they're standard components. But you're right. I think the contractual law has, legal side has a lot to play in this.
Yeah, and then getting the back-to-back contracts between.
Back-to-back contracts, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much for that.
I think maybe one last thing I want to add to what Kevin says. We have to be aware that what this is actually deep technology that is happening out of sight of the people who are using it. Most people in the industry, they're not interested in UIs and how this information is connected, but they want to see that they can rely on it. And I think what we put under the hood, that's what we're talking about today, but how it can be information that is valuable for their processes. That's what we can find out with doing as much as possible pilot projects, because I think it's covering pretty much the entire chain.
Mm.
Yep, no, you're right. Yes. Okay, so just to wrap up for today, look, you can find everything about FIBREE on FIBREE.org. If you're interested, you can send an email to uoi@FIBREE.org to talk to us at the working group. There will be a recording available in the next few days, and that will be uploaded to the webinar subpage of FIBREE.org. So the next edition of the FIBREE Global Webinar Series, which will be on May 29th, that will be about women in blockchain and the real estate sector. So please tune in for that. And thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris, for the moderation.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.